Hey everyone, Dave Floss here with Prometheus Falling Toys and Mentally Imbalanced. And today we're going to go a little bit deeper into our 3D scanning with really small and really detailed objects. So stick around. So a couple weeks ago I posted a video, 2 parts, related to 3D scanning and then 3D printing. And I talked about a couple different scanners and a couple different printers, and ultimately with my focus of being able to generate replacement parts and items for some of the toys and collectibles in my collection. Now I've got a lot of great responses, so first of all, thank you to everyone who watched the video, and thanks you to everyone who provided a response. But there was one response in particular that has prompted me to make this video. And that was, most of my focus from the 3D scanning and 3D printing were medium-size objects. And what I mean by medium is more toy range, within a few inches. And some of them were more detailed than others, but we never really got into the how low or small can you possibly go. So the feedback was, if I'm working on very small scale items, whether they're models or toys or replicas, and I want to be able to scan parts or replacement parts, are we able to get that level of detail from the scanner? So let's start with, I'm going to be focusing not so much on different scanners, but really just some testing with the scanner that I use primarily, which is the Shining 3D SP. Now remember, this scanner goes down to 0.05 millimeters. Most of your consumer level scanners, like the Creality and some of the others, go to 0.1 or about double, right? Now that's double meaning less depth, less feature detail. And in my other video, I point out that that really wasn't sufficient even for the few inch size items that I was doing. So I didn't even want to try to go and recreate or replicate results with that particular scanner. So today we're going to be looking at the Shining 3D Scanner SP with its 0.05 millimeter depth and capability. I'm using all the same settings, and in just a moment I will also share a picture. But to really understand it, let's get into the scans. All right, so here we are in the Shining 3D scanning software. Now I want to call out a couple things right away. All of the scans that I've done are of real objects. They're actually located right now in the bottom part of the screen. I did several different objects to give an idea of, both size, quality, and scale. From very, very small to not as small but highly detailed, and somewhere in between on all of those, to really get a flavor for how did this scanner capture the level of detail based on those parameters. Now the other thing too is all of these were done with the exact same settings, so the quality is meant to be kind of a broad spectrum test without having to super dial in each individual settings. We're going to kind of see where that both worked for us and potentially didn't work as well as we had hoped. And then we're going to talk about not just the scanning quality, but let's look at the mesh. Let's look at the underlaying quality, because that's ultimately what's actually going to print. So we're going to start in no particular order. The first one I have here is the scanning of this Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator head sculpt, measuring about 2 centimeters tall and about 1 centimeter wide. Now right away as we look, and again, I should point out that all of these were single pass, which means it did one rotation. In my earlier video, I talked about, when you're doing really detailed items, you might want to do multiple passes by moving the object in a different position. For example, when he was up, straight up, I had him on a little piece of clay to keep him nice and stable. Very important to make sure the product or object doesn't move while you're scanning it. Well, because the scanner couldn't quite see the top of his head, we definitely have some openings. We're going to see that pretty consistently, as again, I'm going for what was the detail with one round pass, and would it lead me to even think of doing multiple passes to get better quality? In other words, should I even proceed, or is the quality just not where I need it to be? So when we look at the face here, we can see that it captured a lot of detail. Now, there's a couple factors that play into how much detail it captured. From my earlier video, you might remember that certain types of objects are extremely difficult to scan. If it's got clear items, the light that's being used to measure the various distances and textures and the features of the object, the light passes right through it. On the similar note, if it's pure black, that light all gets absorbed. So I thought the Terminator was a good balance because there's really a lot of different tones, but no real hard blacks and no clear sections to it. And we can see we got a pretty good, I mean, really solid level of detail. A little bit of blending around the silver where it couldn't quite capture it, but overall, nice and solid. Now, these were textured scans, meaning it not only scans the product, but it then takes pictures and overlays that so we can actually see the colors and some of those other details. The real proof is when we remove that outer covering, what does the underlying item look like? That's what's going to print. That's what you're going to see. So we can go ahead and remove that overlayment to get just an idea of the details. And if we scroll in just a little bit here, we can see those details around the eyes, the damage around the face, really solid level of detail. Now, the last thing we do to really get a flavor for this is we want to apply a final texture. So we're going to go over to Add Mesh. And we're going to go ahead with Watertight. We want it to close up areas that are open, like that top of the head. So we're going to go ahead and do high detail. Again, the goal here for this video is I want as much detail as possible in my scan. I want this to be pretty much print ready. All right, so our mesh is complete. And now we get a real idea that even without those additional scan passes, what areas got filled in or not. And overall, I would be very happy with the quality of this scan. We're going to go ahead and, again, remove that texture. I want to see what the actual product is going to look like. And we can see a lot of detail all the way down to things like the hair, the ears, the smile, the face, the eyes. As far as being able to print this in resin and have something that then I can paint and duplicate, I think the quality overall is very good. And remember, this is just one round of pass. So if I really wanted to dial it in even more, I could absolutely go and do multiple passes, synchronize these various items, and then apply those to get the absolute highest level of detail possible. But out of the box, ready to go, I think this ultimately looks very solid. We look at the various details of the texture, we look at the back, and you can see it captured a lot. Let's look at this wound in the back of his head. Really great level of detail. And it plays through into the texture of the model as well. So there you have. Now, again, this is probably, again, this is not super tiny, right? We're not getting small yet, but I wanted to show kind of a medium, smaller size item with high detail, and that's going to kind of be our baseline. All right, let's move on to our next scan and our next item. And you may be wondering why all of a sudden I'm in the dark, and that is because as I go through this video, I am actually doing these scans in real time. So the latest scan is this gas container, right? And you know, what I want to demonstrate here is another medium type object, only a couple centimeters tall, a couple centimeters wide, but with a simpler geometry. So when you're thinking about doing scans for models or for other items, you know, depending on their scale and size, I wanted to kind of articulate a couple things. First of all, this is a pretty straightforward scan. It has a nice color scheme to it. If we remove the texture, we can see that it captured almost all of the details, which again, not overly complex details. This is a single pass. So again, we're going to be missing maybe a little bit on the top. But as we go and actually create our model, and for here, I'm going to go low detail because I know that really it doesn't need to overly extrapolate or try to fill in finer detailed items. I'm going to go with a pretty basic mesh, which should move fairly quickly. And we'll get an idea of what the final product would look like. Now, another interesting thing about this is that, remember, scanning does it on a one-to-one basis. So if I was to save this as an STL file and print it right now, it would be the exact same measurements as the original item, almost a one-to-one perfect copy. Now, the one nice thing about that is, of course, if I'm looking for a true duplicate, I've got my duplicate. But another important factor here is that within your, whether it's your STL slicer or within a mesh mixer, you can manipulate these files after the fact and change the scale. So at this point, if I wanted to create this gas can in a different scale, I could absolutely adjust the size of the print, either larger or smaller. And especially with a fairly basic geometry as this, we won't lose any detail. In fact, going smaller, we won't, and going larger would probably look just as well as the original. So now that we've mixed our mesh, we can kind of take a look at it from a few different angles. And we can see that it really did capture exceptionally good quality. There might be a couple minor cleanups here where it filled in. Maybe we want to reduce a little bit of this bubbling here. But again, one pass and we get really, really good quality. Let's again remove the texture. Let's see it without the overlay. And again, we can see this is almost print ready. And that's again with just one scan. So now let's move into the really, really small and highly detailed items. All right, so here's our third scanned item. Now, measurement-wise, this is actually not that much smaller than the other two scans that we've done. A couple centimeters high, 1.5 centimeters wide. The big difference here is highly detailed. So even though it's not, it's around the same size, there's a lot more detail because we're actually scanning a miniature. In this case, a miniature of me and of a cat. Now, if we look at this compared to the picture, we can see we didn't get nearly as much detail, right? We definitely lost some things. The blacks, again, very difficult to scan. Now, I didn't prep this at all. This was take it off the shelf, scan it. So I knew there were going to be some issues here trying to get as much detail as I wanted. But then again, we can't always control the variables. So I kind of wanted to take a look at what it would be like to scan an item like this with that level of detail. Now, again, we're going to go ahead and mix this mesh with high detail, and we're going to see how that turns out. Now, at this point, I should say, while we're waiting on the data to mesh, this is the, I think, worst case scenario, which is trying to scan something that has a lot of very small details and is already small to begin with, right? I don't think you'd be finding this so much if you were doing repair parts. And ideally, if you were, you'd really want to do multiple scans, multiple angles. You're going to want to spend more time on this to get that level of detail. Now, when we look at our final mesh, it's actually not that bad. It's definitely, I'm going to say, especially if we remove our texture, we're going to see that we've lost a fair amount of detail. We have the basic structures and sites, but if you compare that to the level of detail that we had in our original item, yeah, it really did not turn out as well as I would have hoped. But again, this is kind of to show the other end of the extreme. When we go to this small, this level of detail, it's going to struggle. And this is where if I really wanted to get as pristine a copy with all of those details, I'm going to do multiple passes. I'm going to want to be very thoughtful about the light and any light seepage going on around the room or the area where I'm scanning. And lastly, I might want to prep the model by making sure that black colors or reflective textures and colors are muted or controlled in a way that gives me the best possible result. Now, really, if most of your scanning, even if you're doing very small details and very small items for models or otherwise, you should be able to have some control. You're not usually scanning an entire jet plane, right? You're going to be looking to scan the components, whether they're additional components that you want to add or duplicate, etc. And I think that's a key differential here, is trying to do too much in one scan is not going to necessarily give you the results. If I had narrowed this down to, for example, just the cat or maybe just the body, or just a portion of the body, I probably would have had much better results because it's not trying to capture every intricate, microscopic little detail of this fairly complex model. So, all right, with my last scan, I'm able to return to the world of the living and turn my lights back on, and now we can take a look at kind of what I call the sweet spot. And for this particular test, I actually did two things just to see how it would turn out. First, I chose objects that were about 1 centimeter in size or smaller. They have medium detail. In other words, I'm not looking to get each individual hair. And if we think about, again, the purposes of this, the idea was I want to be able to scan replacement parts for smaller scale items, models, or toys, and get enough quality detail out of those. Knowing that those are not going to be, in originality, super high detailed, I wanted to come as close as I could. And for that, I chose these particular miniatures. The other item that I was asked was, well, can you actually scan more than one thing at a time? Now, ideally, depending on what you're going for, scanning one at a time allows you absolute control to do multiple passes, line things up, make corrections, etc. But can you scan more than one 3D object on the plate at any given time? You absolutely can, and let's take a look at those now. So in this particular example, if we look at the picture in the bottom of the screen, we had 3 very small medium detailed miniatures, in this case 3 different animals that I have scanned. And now we can see how that scan of putting all 3 on the plate at the same time turned out. And again, one single rotation. I did not alter or turn or do multiple passes. This is a single pass going around these items. We can see the detail of the cat here. We can rotate around and see the details of the, what I think is a badger here. And then lastly, we can get the details of our fox. Now let's go ahead and mesh. Well, actually, first, let's take a look at them without texture. Now, again, the key here is this is what I would expect from the print quality. And we still retain a lot of those details. We have definitely the geometric shapes. We have the details of the cat, for example, around the eyes and the ears, the face and the snout. Overall, these look really, really decent. Now, we haven't actually mesh mixed them yet, so we're going to do that next because that's going to fill in some of these blank spots where the scanner, with only one pass, couldn't see or get enough detail. Let's see how that turns out. Now for this mesh mix, I'm going to go with, I'm going to actually go medium. I'm going to try to see how medium. I think high is going to try to fill in way too much. I think low might end up just muting it a little too much. We're going to go with medium detail and see how the software is able to fill in the various parts. Also curious to see if it can still clearly distinguish that there are 3 items in their own 3D space and not try to merge or meld or somehow combine those into one. Let's see how it turns out. Well, interestingly enough, it did pretty good insofar that it picked one of the items, and that seems to be what I see here. If I zoom out, yep, it decided that of the 3 items, it was going to focus on only one. So I guess the question of can you scan multiple things at once, let's just say for now, not ideal. Not so much that you can't scan those 3 items and see those 3 items, but if you're going to use the software built in to extrapolate and mesh mix those items, clearly it focused on a single item in that 3D space as opposed to the others. But let's take a look at that particular item. Overall, the mesh is good. We can see the general details and quality. We can go ahead and remove that texture and get an idea of what the final print. There are a few quality issues. We can see here that it didn't quite know what to do with the space underneath the neck and decided to fill that in, basically just fill in this space that would have normally been empty. But again, the key here is not whether or not these particular examples came out perfect. It's looking at right out of the box with basic settings, can this scanner get the level of detail that you would be looking for if you were trying to create duplicate parts in a much smaller scale? And I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. If we go back and look at some of the other scans that we did, yes, some of them were larger. But if we're dealing with smaller items and simpler geometric shapes, this scanner absolutely can capture those in extremely good quality. Now, the more detail we want, or the more detail we try to add, we're going to have to spend a little more time focusing on that one particular piece, and very likely either scan it at multiple angles, have a little more control over our lighting, or dial in some of the other settings and variables to get the absolute best possible quality. But can it be done? I think it absolutely can. So in answer to the question, based on the testing that I have done, can the Shining 3D capture very small items with good quality accuracy? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. Now, I went out of my way to try to pick things that were not very simple geometric shapes. With the exception of the gas can, I really wanted to see if I got into more textures, more details, more 3-dimensionality, and more complex geometric shapes, how would it perform? And again, out of the box, some of them did not turn out nearly as well as I would have hoped, but that's the key. That was without trying to dial in any of the settings or any of the parameters. My other experiences scanning those smaller type objects, when I focus solely on that type of object, have actually been extremely successful. Now, if you're looking to use this, for example, to go to very small scale, 1/32 scale, 1/64 scale, and look to take items, I think there's a couple key things to remember. First, the better the surroundings and how you dial in your settings is absolutely going to play into how well it can scan those smaller objects. 2, the object itself can absolutely control or alter how the scan turns out, whether it's clear, all black, or a highly reflective surface. So that's something else you're going to want to consider. Lastly, the overall complexity. Again, if I was trying to scan an entire small jet airplane model and try to get every individual details from the pipes to the textures to everything else, that's going to be a challenge, right? Even with really dialed in settings. But if I can remove some of those components and scan them individually, then you're going to be able to get much better quality, because even though it's even smaller than the original, it's able to focus solely on that item, and it's able to use it more simple geometry to build out the 3D structure into a 3D file. Now, the last comment I'll make is the only trade-off of doing that is these are going to be potentially extremely small parts. So printing those, whether PLA or resin, might present you a few challenges. And as I've said, having not done something that tiny scale yet myself, I think you're going to want to be thoughtful about when you do the print, how you either add supports or even a raft, a bit of an edge, so that you're adding some stability and then can lightly clean that rafting off after the fact. And ultimately, at that small scale, especially if you want some detail, I think resin ultimately is going to be a much better way to go than PLA, which is going to be pretty small, pretty brittle, and potentially a challenge to print at that tiny scale. But overall, there you go. A look at getting into even more complex and or smaller items with the Shining 3D scanner. What do you think? Is there something else you'd look to scan? Give us your feedback, and of course, we're going to ask you to subscribe so we can bring you this and more videos in the future. Until then, I'm Dave Floss with Prometheus Falling Toys and Mentally Unbalanced, and we'll see you soon.